We were looking at the text of Genesis 1 and just had gotten started on it. We talked a little bit about verse 2, and I just wanted to go back over again some of the things that I've said here with regard to whether or not there's a gap here. The so-called gap theory has been proposed to try to explain long ages of time and to try to place all that time into this gap, so that at the creation, you have a perfect creation, and then sometime after that, you have then Satan disobeying God, rebelling, and being cast out into the earth, causing supposedly a destruction of the surface of the earth, causing then chaos, which is then taken as the meaning of tohu wavohu here in verse 2, and that then God reconstructs and restores the earth prior to beginning then his 6 days of creative activity, starting then with verse 3. Now, as I mentioned last time, there are several different points against a so-called gap theory. Number one is that the Hebrew grammar in verse 2 does not seem to allow for the earth to become empty and formless, or formless and empty. The word there, hayata, is a perfect, and it's a perfect stative, meaning it's a static stative, not a dynamic stative. It doesn't have the idea of becoming, but rather of state of existence. And so it was existing as this condition as a direct result of God's creative activity. The Septuagint uses a form of genomai in order to focus on, or excuse me, not genomai, avoids the use of genomai and uses a form of a me here, the imperfect of a me, ein, the same imperfect, same form of the verb used in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. It was in a state of existence. He didn't come into being, which is the argument, say, for example, of Jehovah's Witnesses, but rather he was continually existing in this state of being. And this is consistent with the Septuagint translation throughout Genesis 1, using a form of genomai for an imperfect of haya, using a form of a me for the perfect of haya. Then we also have the fact that in Exodus chapter 20, in verses 8 through 11, we have the command for the Sabbath observance, the fourth commandment for Sabbath observance, in which we're told very specifically that in 6 days God created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, which means that verse 1 is included in day 1. It has to be included within the 6 days of creation. So those 2 points alone would put a huge question mark on a so-called gap theory. Secondly is the fact that if we have a fall of Satan prior to God's 6 days of creation, and he's been cast out into the earth and limited to that sphere of existence, then how can God's finished creation at the end of the 6 days in Genesis 1:31 be called very good if this earth houses a rebel like Satan, who is going contrary to the will of God? It appears far more logical and far more consistent with Scripture overall to place the fall of Satan sometime after the 7th day in Genesis chapter 2, prior to the temptation, of course, that we see in chapter 3. How soon? Very soon. I mean, look at it. God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And Eve obviously was not pregnant yet. She had not conceived a child. So that child would not then be an exception to all other children by being a child who was born to sinless parents and then not being fallen. So that would help us to see and understand that here we have a situation that took place very rapidly after the creation, where Satan then would rebel. I would refer to Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 13, as a reference to that fall, where you have him as being the one who empowers the prince of Tyre, and you have a description of what it was like for him. And then later in Isaiah chapter, or earlier in Isaiah chapter 14, we have another description that helps to see how Satan fell and what's involved in his fall, Then we'll talk about it again when we get to chapter 3 of Genesis and look at it. In addition to that, the only reason to have a gap theory is to allow millions and billions of years in accord with secular science theoretic conclusions. There's no absolute conclusions with regard to origins. There were no men there present, and nothing that happened in creation can be replicated in the laboratory. And so therefore, it's a matter of faith for both secular scientists and for us as Bible believers to believe what we believe about origins, because there is no direct scientific evidence or nothing that can be repeated in the laboratory to demonstrate or to prove it. And so we're both left on the same ground of having to look back and say, well, I believe it is this way. The difference is that we believe the way we do about God being the creator and creating it as he said in Scripture, because we accept the Scriptures as his word, as direct divine revelation. We accept him as the word of the one who is the creator, so he was present, he was the eyewitness to these events, and then conveyed it to his chosen prophet, Moses, in order that he might record it and keep it. So that's the difference between our two viewpoints. And sometimes we have to, in our discussing this with secular scientists or those who yield to secular science, we have to admit that what we accept here is by faith. There's nothing to be ashamed in that. And there's nothing to be denied in that. We can't say, I've come to this conclusion on purely rational grounds. I've not reached this conclusion by observation or by rational grounds. I've reached it on the matter of faith, accepting that God's record is true and is accurate. And that's where we must stand. And if that brings then the blast of those who deny the authority of Scripture, then let it come. We stand firm in what we believe about it. So as we're going through the text now, I want us to then take a look at how the text continues in verse 3. Because in verse 3, we have God said, let light come to be. Notice the use of the imperfect, yehi. And there's where the Septuagint translators use a form of ginomai. It comes to be, it happens. So light happened, light came to be. Light came into existence or was allowed to perform its duties. As we look at this, we see a pattern, and this is where I want to go next, and you have a PowerPoint presentation of this also that is presented in the course documents that you can turn to and see the full chart there. But verse 3 begins with Wayomer, what God said. We have what he said, Yehi-or. Then we have the result of his command or speaking in Wayehi-or. And then we have his evaluation. Wayara, he saw kitov, that it was good. And then we have a further act of God in dividing, Wayabdiel, here, he divided between the light and the darkness, and he called, Wayikra, the darkness night, and the light he called day. So this is, then we come to the end of that in verse 5, and we have day 1. And it's, and evening came to be, and morning came to be, Yom Echad, day 1. So as we're looking at this, we see a pattern developing because as we move to day 2, we see a similar pattern. God speaking, giving the command, using Yehi again, let something come into existence, and then again, it comes into existence, and then a further action of God, he made something there, and then instead of having the evaluation, notice the evaluation, Wayara, he saw that it was good, is missing. Notice that below Wayara, we have a blank. But we have a new addition, Wayehi-kain, that shows up. And it came to pass thus. This is a way in which you find, for example, in, I believe it's 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 42, or is it second? I think it's 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 42. You have the same type of statement being made about an event that takes place. And these events throughout the Old Testament use the same thing. If a prophet said this will happen and it came to pass, this is what the writer gave as to declare that it happened just exactly as it was said. So Wayikain actually has the meaning of it happened just that way. It happened just that way. It's an emphatic declaration that what is recorded as what God commanded is exactly what happened and the way it happened. And then you have him naming that body of water seas, Yamim, and the dry land then is going to be named earth later. So you have day 3 begins the same way, Wayomer, and then you have him collecting, and then you have Wayikain changing place, interestingly, and then his naming, and then we have, then he saw that it was good, and then on day 3 we have a second round of this format of God speaking, calling for the earth to sprout with herbs, and then it came to pass just that way. So now notice we have a switch of the order of Wayikain. It's beginning to set a pattern that is going to occur earlier rather than later, like it did in day 2. And so it brought forth, and then we have God saw that it was good, and then we have the conclusion of day 3. So what do we have thus far going through those first 3 days? We have God speaking. We have the speech that he spoke. We have the result of those commands. We have God's view given in verse 4 at this stage. We have God's work. We have the result stated in it happened just that way. This is the same as the result that's earlier here in day 3. And then we have naming, and then we have God's view again coming, and this becomes the pattern for the rest. So as we go on through this, then that's what we have. And notice that the evening and morning on the day is the AM, the PM and the AM. This is why the Jewish community today begins the Sabbath at 6 p.m. at sundown on Friday and goes over into Saturday morning, and the Sabbath ends at 6 p.m. on Saturday. Why? The reason for that is because this is the time pattern that God set when he created. You see, you have the evening stated first and then the morning. Why? Because darkness did exist first. And then God said, let there be light, Wayihi or. And then we have the light coming, and that light is the day. And so that tells us that the measuring of the days are the evening and the morning. Interestingly, when I was in Bangladesh working on Bible translation, early on in my learning the Bengali language, I was at a handicap because our team was working in Bengali and translating, and I would give them input from the Hebrew as we went along and as I was learning Bengali. And at one stage, we reached the end of Genesis, and we were preparing to publish it. And I said, we need to go through it one more time. I said, I'm just now getting to the stage where I can understand all the Bengali involved, and I have been asking one of our men to back translate from the Bengali manuscript into English for me so I can double check, and I have found at least one mistake. And they said, what mistake did you find? And I says, our current translation has 8 days of creation, not 7. And they were somewhat astounded and said, well, how did that happen? And I said, it happened because one of the team, after we had our discussions, decided on their own that when it said that darkness existed first, and then it says there was evening and there was morning, day 1, they in their mind interpret, oh, evening, that's the latter part of a day. So the evening is actually the last part of the previous day, day 1, and the morning is day 2. Even though it says day 1. But it began on day 1 with the evening. And I said, by doing that then, what we've inserted is an extra day that isn't there. And we made it 8 days instead of 7, and we know that that's not right. And so I went back to the man who had done the back translation because he did not catch that. His back translation missed it entirely. He gave it in the traditional way. There was evening and morning, day 1. Never said anything about the rest of the text in the Bengali that added that extra day in there. And so I asked him, why didn't you see that? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you translate exactly what's there in the Bengali so we could make this correction earlier than now? And he said, well, I couldn't figure out why that was there, but I figured you people are the ones who know what you're doing. And so I just assumed that it's correct and that this is what was intended. And I says, but you know, you're born Bengali. The Bengali language is your native language. You know that what it says is an extra day. He says, well, yeah, I know that. But he says, the man who serves as your Bengali advisor, he says, one of my own brothers, a Bangladeshi, he says, is a college teacher. He knows the language better than I do, so I assumed that there was something about the language I had not yet learned. That's the problem you go through with the idea of informants and language helpers, etc., when you're doing Bible translation. Because sometimes they look at someone else that's on the team and say, well, he's higher than I am. He has more knowledge than I am. So even though I see what appears to be a problem, I must not rightly understand it. And so I told him, I says, from now on, when you're asked about such things, I said, you give it the way you see it. We'll handle the issues and the relationships to everyone else on the team. It was a fascinating time. Unfortunately, the Bible Society had already published 10,000 copies. Even though we had told them, wait until we approve it. We sent it to them only so that they could see that we were moving along at a good pace and had completed Genesis and were in the final stages. So from that time on, we stamped. I had a special stamp made, and the top of everything that went to the Bible Society had a stamp on the top of every page that said, not ready for publication. So that when it was finally ready for publication, that stamp was missing, and they knew we were ready. 10,000 copies of 8 days of creation sitting out there. That's a nightmare for a Bible translator. It really is. It's terrible. Yes, Daniel.
Is there any significance in it being day one instead of the first day?
No, I don't think so, because we have the same thing done, for example, in Numbers chapter 7, when we're talking about the 12 days of the dedication of the tabernacle, when each of the tribes brings a set sequence of offerings and gifts to the tabernacle one by one, and we have the same basic usage of echad there as well, if I remember right. It seems that it's just the way it's given is perhaps, and we can only say perhaps because we weren't there. I'm not a native classical biblical Hebrew speaker. No one on the earth today is, because all native speakers of Hebrew today are speaking modern Hebrew. And so we have no way of knowing what was the absolute intent, but it would appear that the use of echad was primarily to demonstrate that you have two parts here united into one. Because echad is used later also of the man and woman being one flesh. And you have other usages of echad used that way, where you have a unity being expressed, rather than, say, a uniqueness that is usually done with something like yachid. And so, and again, we can't be definite on that because numbers in their use in Hebrew are notoriously difficult to nail down as to what's an ordinal and what is not an ordinal, what's a cardinal number. They sometimes vary in their usage, and sometimes you'll have two different forms used for the same meaning. The two forms used as an ordinal, or the two forms used as a cardinal. So with that in mind, we have to be very cautious about being definite on why it would be stated. But there's no reason not to accept it as just being ordinal. Okay, good question. All right. As we look at this then and see it, we see this pattern developing. As we go through day 4, we have the same pattern continuing. And we go through day 5, an identical pattern continues, with the addition that on the end of the day, you have a blessing from God for the very first time. So he blessed them, the animals that he created, and told them to be fruitful and to multiply on the face of the earth. And then on day 6, we have a similar type of occurrence that we have in the structure of day 3. Day 3 has 2 rounds of God's speech. Day 6, has 3 rounds of God's speech. Perhaps to demonstrate that this is the climax of creation, perhaps to point out the significance of the creation of mankind on the 6th day that we have this. Now, as we go back over this and look at it, and day 7 comes through very differently. And notice day 6 has a blessing in it, and day 7, we have the 7th day blessed by God. So blessing is days 5, 6, and 7. And as we go back through this, we have to go back to these 2 errant members, the Wayara Kitov and Wayahikain at the beginning, that seem to be out of the standard order, because Wayara then is later placed here at the end. And Wayahikain is moved forward up here right after the fulfillment, the statement, of the command. So whenever we see something that is out of the ordinary, anything that is not the same structure, that is an exegetical key. That tells us that we have to ask the question, why? All right? This applies with everything we look at, no matter what we're looking at, whether we're looking at Psalms that are of the same nature. Excuse me. Whether we're looking at Psalms that have the same nature, 2 laments, personal laments rather than corporate laments, whether we're looking at 2 genealogies, whether we're looking at 2 narratives, whether we're looking at poetry following a narrative but build upon that narrative, we have to always ask the question, why the differences? Why the differences? What are they there for? Why breaking the normal pattern, the normal structure? So as we look at that, I think that the first one, the Wayara Kitov, on the first day, is in order to help us see very early on that everything that God does is good. The quality of His creation is not bad, it's not mediocre, it is good. And indeed later in chapter 1, verse 31, it is very good. But this is significant and important. A good God produces a good creation. A good God prepares for the climax of His creation, mankind, by presenting mankind with a very good environment in which to live and to breathe and to serve Him. This tells us something about God up front, the focus and emphasis, and on the character and nature of His creation. I think also it is to counter any possible misunderstanding of verse 2, which is a misunderstanding conveyed by some of those who believe in the gap theory, that verse 2 represents chaos, that represents a prior destruction of the surface of the earth, that it represents the intrusion of evil, that this lets us know from the very start, even when only light has been called into existence by God by His command at this point, besides the physical earth and space, interstellar space, the heavens, that it is good. It is good. You say, well, why would God do that? Well, I think there are 2 reasons. Number 1, God is omniscient. He knows all things. Remember, He has a plan A, but no plan B. We know that in spite of what some have said in the idea of neo-theism, and there's another name for that I was going to use. Pardon? Open theism, thank you. Neo-theism, open theism. Those who believe in that, like John Sanders, for example, who wrote the book, The God Who Risks. He says that God was caught by surprise by man's disobedience and fall, and He had to move to plan B. Well, if that's true, then why do we have 5 times in the New Testament declared that before the foundation of the heavens and the earth, before the earth was created, the Son of God had already been chosen and appointed to be a redeemer of mankind, fallen mankind, and that God had also chosen whom he would save before the foundation of the earth? That would indicate he was not surprised at all. He was already aware and already begun to plan even before he created, and even before there was man and before the fall. There is no such thing as God being surprised by this unless we outright deny the explicit statement of Scripture. There is no plan B. Plan A and plan A alone. God knew all of this ahead of time. So he understands that fallen man is going to twist the Scriptures and is going to, in some fashion, attempt to attribute some sort of evil, destruction, or chaos to God's original creation, and therefore makes it clear from the start. If it is not that, then this omniscient God knows among whom his people will be living, and what fallen man in the ancient Near East will do with their myths and legends, in which they will make creation a battle between a mighty supernatural being and another coexistent being or condition known as the chaos monster that he will have to defeat in order to create. In fact, even going so far as making evil almost co-eternal with God, or making the physical universe co-eternal with God, as the ancient Near Eastern myths do. Either way, God, knowing, anticipates the questions of his people who will come in the ages to come. And he responds and answers. And I believe that's something he does all the way through Scripture. We talk about God accommodating his revelation to us. This is one of the ways in which he accommodates his revelation to us. He anticipates our questions, and he provides us with answers long before we even ask them. He provides that as necessary. Now, you say, but wait a minute. This is recorded as revelation given to Moses much later, so couldn't it be that God already then is experiencing this in Israel? After all, when Israel was in Egypt, some of them began to worship Egyptian gods. We see that in Exodus chapter 32, where they build the golden calf to worship while Moses is up on Mount Sinai. Could this just be an immediate reference where God is then putting this in? After all, this is part of the narrative framework, not part of the dialogue in Genesis 1, right? It's not what God said when he created. It is his revelation to Moses about what he thought when he created and his evaluation of it. So you could take that view as well, and it still amounts to the same thing, because God is saying, this is really how I believed and felt, and this is the answer you must give to any who feel differently or believe differently. This is the answer you have in the midst of the peoples, the pagan peoples among whom you live. You must remember that my creation is good. And I have thought that, discerned that, and come to that conclusion in my evaluation since the day I created, from that very time on, and that this would be it. Either way, it comes to the same position. And it answers and anticipates those who begin to work then in some way trying to either conform the creation narrative to the narratives or legends of the ancient Near East, or who in their thinking are seeking in some way to explain tohu wavohu by means of some intervention that was external, that God either could not prevent or chose not to prevent, or that he was the cause of in the judging of Satan at that time. It creates a disharmony with the overall narrative, and God makes this clear by this type of statement being put up front. So that's part of the reason. Let's move to the second one, the Wayikane. Why is it placed on day 2 but not on day 1? Why is it moved forward on days 3, 4, and 6? Notice it's missing again for day 5. Why is it not always there? Well, I think again we'd have to perhaps take a look at the 5th day and see why it's missing from there, and say, why is it necessary for him to continue to repeat it? It's repeated twice in day 3 already, which is already an exception. And twice again on day 6, indicating the significance of these two. And we'll come back to that later, because I believe that there's an answer to that reason for it being twice on each of those 2 days. The total number of times, as we look at it here, is that we have 4, 5, 6 occurrences. And we also, on Wayara Kitov, have 7 occurrences there. The 6 instead of 7 is in order that we might place greater emphasis upon God's creation being good than we place upon it happened just exactly that way. He doesn't want us to lose track of that first, because there's something significant here going on. There's a hint here that this is a key theme that we must follow and observe throughout the book of Genesis, not just here. Later, when we get to chapter 2, we find out that there's a tree of the knowledge of Tov and Ra, of good and evil. And that good is going to become a very important part of the overall story. I think that's one of the reasons why it is being put up front here and being talked about the way it is, and why it's 7 times and not just the 6 that we have for Wayikane. But Wayikane is placed near the end of day 2, because there you have already stated both the command and the result and God's subsequent work. So that now we understand that Wayikane applies to both areas, because it follows both areas. Later, it can be said ahead of that area, spoken of as command, understanding it still applies to any actions that follow. And I think the emphasis is, and it happened just this way. It's the narrator's way, under the superintending work of the Holy Spirit, to say, look, God's revelation to me of what he said and how things happened, I'm recording it accurately. This is exactly what happened. It's not the figment of man's imagination. It's not man's creative impulse to write a creation story. It's not the idea that this is my viewpoint, but my viewpoint could be in error because I'm only perceiving this as a human being and I'm trying to put the best spin on it I can with limited knowledge. It's not that I'm writing an allegory and you must interpret it spiritually to understand what's being said. Instead, it's that historian's declaration of accuracy, the same accuracy given later in the historical books of the Old Testament when a prophet's statement or prophecy comes true and is fulfilled. Wayikane, it happened just exactly the way it's written, just exactly the way it's spoken. I look at that as one of those things that tell us that this narrative of creation is accurate. And God saw fit to remind us of it all the way through. I've been reading in Leviticus, and it's interesting. As we go through and we read the Pentateuch, as we read the Torah, each book has some characteristics to it. And the characteristic of Leviticus is how often we have Yahweh spoke to Moses, or Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, or Yahweh spoke to the people. Almost every single area of Leviticus, every section of the text is structured to begin with that statement, the declaration. And it goes on then to summarize and say that Israel is bound to complete, to fulfill, to obey all these commandments and statutes and regulations that God has given, because he has spoken. It makes it very serious. It parallels with it the repetition of the root kadesh, that which is holy, whether it's referring to the sanctuary, the holy place, whether it's referred to consecrating things, or in other words, to sanctify or to bring into condition of being holy, or whether it's just the adjective, holy. Thinking of the holy things of God, the holy sacrifices, the holy vestments of the priest, etc. And God says you are to be holy because I am holy. And when we look at that, we see that this is thematic then of the book of Leviticus. It's telling us that this is under the authority and command of God, who is a holy God and desires his people to be holy. So as we're looking here at Genesis 1, the first chapter of the Hebrew Bible, what do we see as a theme or as an element? This emphasis upon this is exactly what took place. Again, why? Because an omniscient God understands that what man is not there to see becomes a matter of faith. Because faith is that which depends upon things which are not seen, which are invisible, and yet believes, accepts what God says about it. And right up front, we're being told that this is an accurate and historical narrative that we can trust, because everything happened exactly as recorded in this chapter. We don't have to wait till chapter 12 to start history, which is what many evangelical scholars today do. I mean, in the debate with Walton and Lamoureux and Collins on the historicity of Adam, it's Walton and Lamoureux especially who said I start accepting as historical at Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 1 through 11 is non-historical or ahistorical. It's without historical foundation and therefore not to be interpreted in the same fashion. It's different literature, it has a different reason, a different purpose, and it should not be taken as historically accurate. Then why does God 6 times in chapter 1 record here, Wayehi Cain? And why are the only other occurrences in those places in the Old Testament where we're talking about the fulfillment of prophecy exactly as spoken? It behooves us to respond by saying there's no reason not to accept this as history, by the fact that God has made certain by highlighting these 2 errant themes within the order, that the very first occurrence of this is out of order to focus on it, and the very first occurrence of this is to focus on it. These are the 2 foci. These are the 2 emphases that we want to follow them throughout the reading of the entire text. One is theocentric. It has to do with the nature of God, the nature of his creation. The second is bibliocentric. It's revelatory. It has to do with the trust and faith we have in the written record of whether it's accurate or not. It's narratival in its focus. And therefore, it helps us to better understand the text. Let me stop here and ask if you have any questions as we've looked at this in chapter 1. Any questions? Yes, Daniel.
At what point would the original audience notice that the first day was different? Because there's no pattern established until after the pattern was broken.
I don't know at what point the original audience would notice this. I would assume, first of all, that the original audience would be far more sensitive to the Hebrew text than we are. So I think that anything we can observe with our limited knowledge would definitely be something they observed and probably dwelt on in some degree. In fact, we do know that the rabbis, and here we're depending on things much later, the rabbis maybe beginning some of their writing as early as 400 BC, but most of their writing beginning to formulate and coalesce around 100 BC. We have the rabbis noting these as being different and distinct. And if we look at some of the commentaries of Rashi, which was much later, I mean, you're talking about 11th century AD now, we're looking at men like Rashi and others. They're observing it and seeing it, and we have no reason to doubt that maybe they're observing it because they're repeating what earlier rabbis had said and going back into, say, the Mishnah and observing some of the things that are recorded there that indicate that these are phrases of significance. Whether or not they take them the same way that I'm taking them now is another matter. I mean, if I remember right, the way the first one is taken there is explained away because of the rabbis trying to avoid making God like man. They viewed this as an anthropomorphism. And so when they said that God saw that these things were good, that what he had created was good, their first thing is to deny any anthropomorphic interpretation. And secondly, their focus was to demonstrate that the nature of God is good. They didn't really deal that much, as I remember it, with the idea of the creation itself being good, and not at all, as I remember, comparing it with, say, verse 2. So that is my own tie there that I'm taking to verse 2, not something I saw in any of the rabbinical writings. That doesn't mean there's no rabbi who didn't note it. I'm constantly amazed when I'm reading the rabbis or when I'm reading the early church fathers that so many things that I think, well, hey, you know, this has been noted by commentators at least recently, perhaps since the Reformation. I'm constantly amazed to find out that some have noted this long before. For example, when we're looking at creation, the first thing we see is that the animals and the plants and mankind are created mature and ready to reproduce immediately. Correct? And we talk about that being created with the appearance of age. I used to think that the first ones to really talk about this came in the 19th century when you have the early debate against evolutionism going on, and you have Christian pastors and scholars beginning to respond to the evolutionary argument of distant ages by saying that the man and the animals and the plants are created with the appearance of age, and so therefore the earth itself could be created with the appearance of age. It looks old. And that was before they even realized that there was a problem with distant starlight that they had to account for. That was unknown at the time to even talk about. And so some have even accused creation scientists of then adopting this type of argumentation in recent days, but it's something that the early church people never saw or never brought up. But Ephraim of Syria, in the 4th century AD, in the 300s AD, made that very observation. He was very specific about it. He sounds like a scientific creationist in his evaluation. He's pointed out. So we can see that we're not the first to think about these things. We're not the first to debate these things. We saw that Augustine thought about these things and even compared it to what secular science was saying. This is not a new debate at all, and it's not new observation at all. And so I think that there's the amount of material is voluminous among the church fathers and among the rabbis. Who knows what might be there that we're just not touching upon or not seeing. We have some men that are working on those various areas and trying to make certain they bring things out. And one of the issues that always comes with that too is we have to look at the original language rather than looking at those things in translation. You have to look at the Aramaic and the Hebrew of the rabbis. You have to look at the Greek and the Latin of the church fathers in order to rightly understand what they're saying, because some English translations obscure the meaning or direct us a wrong way and give us an impression that that's what they said when that's really not the way they said it or what they said. So there's much more to be done there. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised to find someone among the rabbis or the early church fathers already made that tie. But at this point, in my limited research and knowledge, I have not found it. And I've not read any commentator who has located that himself either. Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir.
You alluded to this earlier, just wondering if I missed the answer, but why ye Cain is not mentioned in verse 1 and 5.
All right, good. It's not mentioned in the first day and not mentioned in the fifth day, right? In the first day, I don't think it's time yet to mention it because you don't have an action or a work of God proceeding there like you do in verse 7 in day 2. Where there in verse 7 in day 2, notice as we go back here, we have that God made the expanse. You have an action, a creative action there that's being talked about. And we go back into verse 3 when we're talking about God said, let there be light, and light came into being. Notice it does not say he made light. It doesn't say, Vayas Elohim ha'or. In fact, we don't have any such action until we get to verse 4 when we have God divided between the light and the darkness, and that could be taken really as epexegetical. It can be taken as a result. Thus, he divided, because the very fact you have light coming into existence means that now both exist. And so it's not that God had to have a separate action of division in order to divide. It's the creation of it itself divided. And so therefore, I think that Vayikain is not used there because he has not actually performed an action as clearly as we find it then in verse 7. I think that's why it waits for that, to make certain that we understand it's not just the fact that God spoke and things happened. It's the idea that God spoke and God worked. And in both of those, it all happened exactly this way. Does that help? Now, as to its absence on day 5, that's another matter. Some have suggested that its absence in day 5 is because we have the second use of the verb bara. We had bara in verse 1, and we have bara in verse 21. And perhaps it's not necessary to state the obvious at that point. Others have said, those especially arguing for a poetic nature of the genre here, a poetic nature of the literary form, have argued that if you add Vayikain here, it then makes this day 5 overly heavy because we already have an addition on day 5 of Vayavrek, and he blessed. And that could be that type of balance and a sense of balance in the wording and in the text is something that doesn't belong only to poetry. It is also found in the narratives. And Robert Bergen most recently wrote about that with regard to Genesis chapter 22, where we have a narrative there of Abraham offering Isaac up on Mount Moriah. He makes the point that in Genesis 22, there are ellipses, there are arrangements, there are additions, there are the order and structure of the text that show that the writer wanted to balance certain parts of the structure and the narrative. And so the fact that we have balance going on here then doesn't tip the scales to us understanding this as poetry. It's just what we'd call perhaps poetic prose. It is sophisticated prose. It is highly structured prose as we're looking at it. And so that could be the reason on day 5. Another offer here that's been offered according to a rabbi friend of mine, I don't know where he got it or if it's his own idea, but that perhaps the absence of it in day 5 is because God's desire is not to sort of put more emphasis and focus on the beasts, on the animals, than on man. And he points out that to him it's significant that Vayikain does not occur on day 5 when the beasts or the animals are created, but occurs twice on day 6 when man is created. Why? Because man is far more significant than the beasts. God values man more than the beast. Now, don't take that as if God doesn't value the beasts. All right? That's going to an extreme in that. Could it be that God, again, being a God who is omniscient, understands that sometime in the course of history, and it occurred long before Darwin, by the way, even among the ancient Greeks, there was a theory of evolutionism in which man is kind of an advanced form of prior animals. It's not new to Darwin. He's picking up some of the ancient Greek philosophers and writers and building on some of the concepts and ideas they had as early as Plato. They're talking about the origin of man and what his relationship to creatures are and animals. And there's already a thought of development from the animals. That God, in his omniscience, foreseeing this, then allows the focus to come solely upon man in a way, perhaps, again here, we're reading in the white spaces between lines, so we cannot be dogmatic. When we get dogmatic about things we see in the white spaces, we run into trouble. But perhaps it's because, foreseeing that, he wants here in the text to emphasize man as opposed to the animals, knowing that later man is going to pervert the view of the relationship of man and animals. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you think there's any significance to God blessing on days 5, 6, and 7, but not on the previous days?
Yes, I think there is. I think that's a good thing to observe, that his blessing comes on days 5, 6, and 7. Here, because we're reaching the climax of creation, because everything that has to do with his kingdom, because notice in days 1, 2, 3, and 4, we really have preparation for the climax of creation. Notice that the animals that Adam names in chapter 2 are those created on day 5, not necessarily all those creatures created on day 4. Notice that God's making a distinction between land animals as opposed to sea creatures. That God is making a distinction between what man is to rule over and govern primarily. Notice that when we come later in Genesis, when we have the ark, it's land animals and birds that are brought into the ark, not sea creatures and water creatures. There is a pattern here to the significance of these in such a way that when the animals come off the ark in Genesis chapter 9, they again are blessed and given the same mandate, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And man is also given that repeated mandate at that time. It's not something that's spoken to the sea creatures. And so there's a consistency here throughout the early chapters of Genesis in highlighting this. And so this could be covenant anticipation, because when we get to this term next of having Barrick talked about, we're going to be talking, especially the key is Genesis 12, where God is going to bless the seed of Abraham, and through the seed of Abraham is going to bless all nations. It becomes a key theme, but that theme of blessing, we're going to find throughout in different places, but it seems to always anticipate covenant or develop covenant or look forward to covenant, if not involve covenant. Question, Josiah.
Going back to the chiastic structure you mentioned last week, would this have any relation to Revelation not having a sea, like the lack of presence?
That's a good question. I like that idea, that concept, that perhaps that's one of the reasons it's involved. I know many people are very disappointed that the new earth is not going to have an ocean. Especially those that are surfers, Can't imagine existing without oceans. That could be the reason. It could be that throughout all the ages, really, we have the concept or idea that the sea is used of that which is restless. It's used of that out of which rebellion comes, in the book of Revelation especially. I'd be hesitant to try to get into allegorical interpretations or try to figure out the figurative nature of that and how far it should be taken. But that could be a reason right there, that the focus is upon that which God blesses, and what God blesses is what he's going to have continue to exist throughout eternity in the new heavens, new earth.
Has there been any work on sort of, for lack of better terms, of theology of the sea or anything as it, or like tracing like a words?
Yes, there has been. There's been a number of people write on it from a number of viewpoints. There have been Seventh-day Adventists that have written on it. There have been evangelicals, dispensationalists, and Reformed theologians who have dealt with it. And there are many others in the liberal camp who have tried to deal with this, and some who have dealt with it within the context of the ancient Near East and its same highlighting or not highlighting the oceans and the seas. There's a lot of work out there, a lot of material to pursue.